a family also remains large. In the UK, working age women do on average 1.5 fewer hours of paid work and 1.8 more hours of unpaid work per day than men. I know research by the IMF has shown that that average of 2 hours more of unpaid work per day is true across the world, with huge variation across countries, of course. Now, over the past 2 years, the pandemic has imposed additional and exacerbated challenges. We all know that the pandemic has done immense damage, not least by eroding some of the advances made by women in the workplace in recent years. Fixing that damage must involve a renewed focus on the gender wage gap and a new focus on the gender talent gap. Last year, I joined leaders from the IMF, the European Central Bank, the World Trade Organization, the European Commission, and the UN, all of whom happen to be women, to call on the G7 governments around the world to prioritize gender equality as they seek to recover from the economic impact of COVID-19. From tolerating gender pay gaps to neglecting childcare and education, governments have not prioritized women's needs. And women's jobs have been shown to be nearly twice as vulnerable than men's in this pandemic crisis. The response to COVID-19 provides an opportunity to accelerate progress toward gender equality and build stability and opportunity for everyone. So after years of talks and preparatory work, the Hub for Equal Representation in the Economy is officially launched today. We aspire to deliver meaningful and tangible benefits to individuals, communities, and economies all around the world. And we want to make equal gender opportunities and the challenge of underrepresented minorities a topic of mainstream economic research that attracts the world's best scholars. We'll develop an innovative research agenda on the economics of gender and underrepresented minorities. The Hub is formed by a team of leading economics researchers at LSE who are committed to find effective ways to improve the representation of women and minorities at work. It's meant to be a place where academics, policymakers, and business leaders come together in the search for a more balanced and diverse economy. The Hub is the result of a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and we are incredibly proud of that partnership. Our ambitions and missions have profoundly resonant parallels to understand the causes of things and to create solutions for people with the most pressing needs. Equality really can't wait, and we're hopeful our shared objectives will offer an unprecedented opportunity for global impact. And I'm especially pleased that Kalpana Kochhar, Director of Development Policy and Finance at the Foundation, and a very dear former colleague of mine at the IMF, will tell us more about this important work today. A crucial part of the Hub's work is based on collaboration with companies willing to share their data and wanting to contribute to an understanding of which policies work and don't work. They'll help us answer questions of mutual interest, such as how to build a workplace that works for all, how to attract and retain female talent, or how to design a promotion system that's effective and fair. The idea is to provide the business community with evidence-based guidance around equal representation issues. They, in turn, will provide quantitative insights and expertise on issues such as diversity, hiring, and retention. The Hub's researchers analyze organizations' data and use state-of-the-art models to obtain deep and original insights into the needs and challenges facing companies today. They help diagnose individuals' companies' strengths and weaknesses in creating an inclusive workplace. The ongoing research projects being developed by the Hub leave no doubt of the relevance of the work and the need for more of it. Oriana Bandiera, co-director of the Hub, has been paying special attention to the way our society allocates talent and what the pay gap tells us about untapped talent. She asked how much we lose in economic terms by maintaining structures that keep women at home. And her research offers very revealing data. For example, addressing the misallocation of female talent and eliminating the barriers that keep women out of the labor market could increase productivity on average by 32%. However, cultural norms, social conventions, and economic strictures mean that it's still significantly harder for women to enter the job market and pursue a career than it is for men, especially in some countries. The research of our other co-director of the Hub, Camille Landé, focuses on so-called child penalties. His work shows very clearly how the birth of the first child has a negative impact on women in the workplace worldwide. The penalty persists for up to 20 years after the birth of the first child and explains most of the remaining gender gap. Camille has mapped the world with state-of-the-art statistical methods to find out that after the arrival of the first child, pay for women and employability invariably diminish, while men remain essentially unaffected. His research shows that gender imbalances are not an immutable reality. They can be corrected, and policies and gender norms can and should have an impact on reducing the size of the child penalty. And finally, Nina Russi, the executive director of the Hub, has conducted striking research on what has been labeled the ask gap, which plays a crucial role in wage gaps. Her research shows that in the hiring process, women ask for lower salaries than men, and that it can explain 100% of the gender differences in salary offers from firms. This costs women in high-paying jobs thousands of dollars a year. And some of these exciting results will be discussed in more detail today by the team and as a springboard for future research by the Hub. Reflecting its mission of bringing together researchers and practitioners to come up with creative solutions, the Hub has put together a very impressive pool of experts, global academics, and business leaders who will share with us today the insights of their research and their experiences. They'll take different approaches, but they all share the same goal: making equality work. I hope today's event is incredibly productive and inspiring. I'm incredibly proud that this is being hosted at the London School of Economics, and I can't wait to see the transformative impact on equal representation around the world. Thank you all very much, and I'm going to hand over to Oriana.
Thank you so much, Minouche. This is a fantastic introduction. I'm gonna add some slides to the mix because we cannot speak unless we have slides. So let me see if this can be done. Okay. I think you should see some slides now. So this is welcome to the Hub for Equal Representation. I'm going to tell you briefly who we are, what we're doing, and this is why we're doing it and how we're doing it. Well, this is the team. You can go on our website, which is what I'm doing here. And Minouche has kindly introduced us already. So you know us, but you don't know the most important people in the team, who are our junior affiliates. These are the people that do all the work. So we're very lucky to have Amen, Gabrielle, Atina, Gabriela, Christian working for us. And we will keep hiring people as we go along. So if anybody knows good students, anybody likes to work on this, please get in touch. Next thing, what? Minouche has explained it much better than I could. But in a nutshell, we want to understand the causes, because if we don't know the cause, we cannot fix the problem. And solutions to improve the representation of women and minorities, other minorities in economics and in the economy. Now, today will be mostly about women because that is the one minority in economics that has received most attention. But our work will cover all forms of underrepresentation. We're actually working with the European Economic Association to start a new prize for the best paper that deals with the underrepresentation of minorities. The why is, I think, the bigger question. Why do we still need, in 2022, a hub and research for equal representation? We should not forget that we've made enormous progress. My grandmother married at 14 and had 6 kids by the time she was 20. She had 2 years of education. I married at 30-something. I have 20-something years of education. And this is a pattern, well, maybe not 20 years of education, but this is a pattern that's all over the world. These floating bits here are different countries in the world. And on the vertical axis, you have the gender ratio of years of schooling between men and women. That's 100. And you see that most countries in the world are at or above the 100 line. Okay? The bubble, the size of the bubble is the size of the country. So the two big ones are China and India, obviously. The only countries that are still below the parity are all in sub-Saharan Africa. But you see that there is a strong convergence in education. So my grandmother always told me, study all you can. I took her literally, but it looks like many other people have done so as well. But despite this enormous progress in education, in closing the gap in education, societal norms are not moving as nearly as quickly as needed. Right? This is an ad that came out at the beginning of the pandemic. I don't think it needs much comment, but if you look closely inside the little houses, there are the women who take care of children, women who teach children, the women who clean the house, and the men sit on the couch. Interestingly, and perhaps more scarily, the little girls in the family, what the mother is doing. So there is a very precise gendered role division of work in the household. Okay? And this translates then in data in very skewed ratio. So these are the ratio of work inside and outside the household. The orange is work inside the household, unpaid work, and the blue is work outside the household, and is the ratio men to women. And you can see in every country, women do a lot more work inside the household, and men do a lot more outside the household. When women are outside, this is from a recent chapter for the Deaton Review on Inequalities that Camille and I wrote, you see that there is a huge gap in hours. That's the first graph here. And as well as a huge gap in pay per hour, which is the second graph there. Okay? We highlight the UK because the chapter is mostly about the UK, but these are all OECD countries. South Korea and Japan are at the extreme, but in every country in the OECD and every country in the world, there is a total earnings gap, which is made of two components. Women work less, are less likely to participate in the labor force, and when they do, they are paid less. So that sums up to a large earnings gap. So in the time that I've left, I want to discuss how we do what we propose to do here. We call our center a hub because that's what we want to be. We want to be the place where people go to for research and data on equal representation. We offer resources for researchers. So one big aim of the hub is to collect new data. Camille and Henrik, who are in the panel after this, the first panel today, are doing an amazing job at collecting data on child penalties. That is how much women lose when the first child is born. And this map here shows the coverage that they've had all over the world. So these are the data that they're putting together for these countries. Once they'll be done with this, they'll have an outstanding data set where for each country, you'll be able to measure the child penalty. They're doing this work with Gabriel here at the Hub. Another initiative which we launched recently together with the European Economic Association is a call for research proposals on career structures in economics. Right? We know that the way the academic career is organized might be detrimental to certain groups. Right? Late seminars, the tenure clock coinciding exactly with the most fertile years in the reproductive cycle. There are a number of dimensions of the way academic careers are organized, which can be seen, even not intentionally, which can have the effect of putting women at a disadvantage. This initiative calls for economists to sort out the economics profession themselves. So analyze careers, different types of career structures, maybe a tenure clock that you can choose when to start. Everybody gets 7 years, but they choose when to start the 7 years. And we are inviting research proposals and we are funding them. And research proposals which come up with good policy suggestions which are implementable will be taken into account in the policy design of the European Economic Association. And of course, this knowledge will be public and free for any department to adopt and to act on. Okay. So if you have some brilliant idea of how to make things better, you can apply for this program. So this is the hub and researchers. This is what we can do for researchers, provide data and provide initiatives to fund research which is related to the aim of the hub. The second component, which is at the heart of our model, is the collaboration with firms. Because ultimately, as Minouche said, we are not an ivory tower. We don't want our research to remain here with ourselves, looking at our screens and say, look how cool that graph came out. We want this research to be useful. And in order for the research to be useful, it has to come and it has to go back the places where it can be applied, which is organizations themselves. My co-author and good friend, Nav Ashraf, who's in the second panel, has created this cogeneration of knowledge model, and she will tell you more in a couple of hours about how the model works. But here, just to give you an overview, what we really hope is to find firms that we can partner with in order to answer questions of common interest. Okay. There are no fees, there's guaranteed anonymity, and the findings are jointly owned. Let me just briefly tell you about the two key components of this model. The first is the key questions of common interest. That's what makes the partnership works. The partnership only works if both researchers and practitioners want to know the answer to the same question. And it's that common interest that keeps the research going and keeps the firm or the organization sticking to the research design, because we all want to know the same answer. So if interests are aligned, cooperation is quite easy. And these are examples of questions that we can address. And because it's a cogeneration model, it's not a consultancy model, it's not a matter of us researchers providing a service or answering questions posed by the firms, but rather is a model where the knowledge is generated together and comes back to the firms. There are no fees. The researchers are paid in data and in discoveries. And firms benefit presumably from the results of the research. So that is in essence the way this model works, and is being applied successfully in many settings. this is the Hub email. You can contact us if you're a firm, if you're a researcher interested, if you want to collaborate in any way with the Hub. We can also, aside from one thing I forgot to say, aside from answering specific questions, we can also do careful statistical analysis of the gender gap in firms. Many firms are required by law to report their gender gaps, but the typical reports of gender gaps focus on the average, which tell us very little about the anatomy of the gap in the firm. Okay? Because the average is made of, especially for large firms, is made of many different things. So you want to know whether the gap comes from, say, the very top of the distribution. So is the gap coming from the C-suite, where there are only men, or men and women, but women are paid a lot less? Or is the gap coming from middle management? Or is the gap coming from both of the salary distribution? Those can produce identical average gaps, but of course the policies that one has to implement to take care of that gap, to eliminate the gap, are different depending on which part of the distribution the gap is coming from. So a very straightforward form of collaboration is the analysis of pay gaps in your organization. I think that's enough for me. Thank you for listening. And I'll introduce our first panel. Our first panel will be chaired by Camille Landin, my colleague here at the LSE, and has very distinguished colleagues who have done a lot of work on women in academia and in the real world. So Barbara Petrongolo, Henrik Kleven, and Petra Moser. The floor is yours.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks a lot, Oriana, for these introductory comments and the presentation of the Hub. So I'm Camille, I'm a professor of economics at the LSE, and I'm, as Oriana said, co-director with Oriana and Nina of the Hub. It's a great pleasure to be chairing this first panel session with you today. So as been explained by Oriana and Minouche, a very core component of what we do at the Hub is research on the representation of women and also of minorities in the economy. The one thing to understand about this research component is that it's not just about conducting frontier research on these issues, it's also about aggregating the knowledge. It's about disseminating it. And for this, what we do a lot as well is rely on a great network of researchers who work on these issues. And what we do is, well, we get together and we discuss the extent of what we know and also the extent of what we don't know and what we should do about it in order to enlarge our knowledge of these important issues. And I think today's session is a great demonstration of how we aim to fulfill this mission. I'm extremely excited to have with me three of the most distinguished scholars on this issue of gender inequality. We have Barbara Petrongolo. Barbara is professor of economics at the University of Oxford. She's also a fellow of the British Academy. She is the director of the labor economics program at H.E.R, and she has worked extensively on issues of gender inequality, putting a lot of emphasis in particular on the role of structural transformation of the economy, and also on the mechanics of interactions within the household in shaping this inequality. We also have Petra Moser with us today. She's joining us from the other side of the pond. Good morning, Petra. Thanks for making it. Petra is professor of economics at New York University. And she is a world-renowned economic historian with a very important contribution to the economics of science and innovation. She's worked a lot as well on the representation of women in science and in academia. And that's very important, she's actually promoting very actively the representation of women in our profession as well through her work, for instance, in the Committee on the Status of Women in the Economics Profession. And finally, we have Henrik Leven with us today, also joining us from the other side of the pond. Good morning, Henrik. Henrik is Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at Princeton University. He's also co-editor of the leading journal in our profession, the American Economic Review. I think he will agree with me that his greatest achievement in life has been to be our colleague at the LSE until 2017. Henrik has been working a lot on the issue of gender inequality, emphasizing in particular the role of children and the role they play in the persistence of gender gap in the labor market. So I'm extremely excited to have this conversation with the three of you today. Let me just briefly explain the setup, how it's going to work. So we're going to have a discussion with introductory comments from our panelists, and then an open Q&A. For the Q&A, everyone in the audience is able to ask questions to our panelists. So please put your questions in the Q&A box that you're having on Zoom, and then I'll collect them and I'll be moderating this discussion with the audience. But importantly, it's not just you who are going to be able to ask questions today. We are going to also ask questions to you. And you're going to see it's a fun way to keep the conversation lively in these virtual events. And it's also a great way to showcase just the extent of our common lack of knowledge or sometimes biased beliefs on these important issues. So how it's going to work, very simply, you're going to see every now and then some questions pop up, and you just click on your preferred answer. All of this is going to be dealt on Zoom. Okay? Now, without further ado, let me turn to Barbara first. So, Barbara, can you tell us maybe a little bit more about the current state of knowledge on gender inequality, where gender gaps in the labor market stand currently, and what we know about the key drivers behind them?
Thanks very much, Camille, for your very nice introduction, and thanks for inviting me to the launch of this very exciting initiative. I'd like to share some slides, if possible. So, can you see my screen? Excellent. So I'll kickstart this panel discussion by highlighting a few important features of gender inequalities and also what policy can or cannot do about them. So as Minouche and Oriana were anticipating at the beginning of this session, despite decades of significant progress, there are still important hurdles to gender equality in all countries. So there are large and persistent gaps in employment and wages. Women still make systematically different choices in education, choices that in particular are less conducive to financially rewarding careers, and also they bear the whole penalty to motherhood. Now, in sort of childcare and unpaid work, the gender gaps in paid work are more than offset by women's disproportionate involvement in care responsibility and domestic work, even among women who are the breadwinners in their household. So this can be all the more striking against the backdrop of equalized education opportunities and equal pay legislation, which has been in place in decades in most countries. So the first thing that we might ask is whether this is a problem. Why do we care at all? And we may care, first of all, for issues of equities and equal opportunities for men and women in the labor market, but also there is a problem of misallocation of talent, because if there are barriers to women entry in certain occupation, then this implies that we are not using men's and women's talent in the best possible way. So this is, of course, a complicated issue, and there are a variety of perspectives and views, but then I will try to summarize existing views and existing work on the topic in two main areas. So in one view, gender differences, basically they come from gender differences in characteristics, in traits. So for example, men and women have different skills, they have different psychological traits that drive both their educational choices and their labor market experiences. So in this case, gender inequality is simply a reflection of those differences in characteristics. And then the other view is that men and women perhaps are similar in all possible respects, in all relevant dimensions, but they face different opportunities and constraints. For example, these may be related to work-life balance, they might be related to norms and stereotypes, and other similar considerations. So starting from differences in traits, there is now a body of work investigating gender differences in characteristics and preferences like self-confidence, risk-taking behavior, pro-social behavior, and understandably lack of self-confidence or extreme risk aversion or pro-social behavior may interfere with one's labor market success. So if the audience is willing to participate, I would like to ask, what is your take on male and female characteristics in a very important trait, which is self-confidence? So I hope that Camille can help me with this poll.
Let's go ahead up. So, yeah, excellent. So go ahead, Barbara, if you want to ask the question yourself so that, yeah, everybody's there.
Yes, so I would like to click on how you would rate men on self-confidence. So you have 5 choices: very overconfident, moderately overconfident, realistic, moderately underconfident, and very underconfident. So you can make a choice here on the panel.
A few more seconds to answer, and then I'll stop the poll.
Yeah, just tell me when I can move to the other question for women.
Yeah, I think we're good. 72% participation rate, it's legit.
That's pretty good, thanks. So the next question is about women. How would you rate women as very overconfident, moderately overconfident, realistic, moderately underconfident, or very underconfident?
I'm sorry to interrupt, Barbara. I have to share the results of the first question before I can move on to the next one.
Okay.
So you should see them on the screen now.
Okay, okay. Yes, so I can see that men are 29% very overconfident and 68% moderately overconfident. So basically, we have like 97% of overconfident men. Okay, we can move on to women.
I think that's great stuff. We yeah, you've already made your point, Barbara. It's beautiful.
So can we see? Okay, there we are. So among women, we have about 8% overconfident, 24% realistic, and the rest, about 70% underconfident. So remember these numbers: men 97% over, women 70% under. And then I'd like to compare this data, the data that you've just put together, with what professional economists think, academic economists think. And I can tell you, you're very similar to the vast majority of economists. So 77% of economists precisely believe that men are overconfident and women are underconfident. So in this figure, those lower bars represent the evidence that we get from the data, that we get from papers that investigated empirically the differences in overconfidence between men and women. And then between 72% and 83% of results find that both men and women are overconfident. So there isn't such a thing as underconfident women. And in particular, whenever those differences are found, they are small and they're very context specific. So typically, we tend to have misperceived beliefs about gender characteristics. Now, another kind of interesting point that I'd like to make is that those sort of differences in characteristics that sometimes we emphasize in gender research, maybe there are some differences in the main characteristics of men and women, but those differences are typically dwarfed by within gender differences. So this diagram here represents a sort of very approximate distribution of self-esteem among men and women, putting together evidence from a bunch of studies. So the distribution for men lies a little bit to the right from the distribution of women. So there is a tiny difference perhaps in the mean, but as you can see, the overlap between the respective distribution is so large that if we simply try to explain gender differences in outcomes, focuses on gender differences in traits, then we are probably looking in the wrong place. So I'll talk more about gender differences in barriers. So as I said before, barriers stem from a variety of sources. You can think of work-life balance considerations. You can think of stereotypes and social norms, possibly more. So the reason why work-life balance considerations might matter more for women than for men is because women remain the main providers of childcare, domestic work in general, and this may set limits on the labor market displacement, especially in careers that require continuous adjustment and they're highly forgiving of career breaks. Now, there are some recent developments that make it hard to digest why the mother penalty is so stubbornly high. I mean, there's been medical progress that has provided substitutes to maternal lactation, job-protected parental leave and childcare subsidies, which should allow women to combine careers and motherhood. And then there is also the rise in low-wage, low-skill migration, which should provide substitute to maternal childcare. So perhaps it means that there are less visible barriers that limit the substitutability of maternal childcare and maternal roles in general. So this brings us to the discussion of stereotypes and norms. So this is what I'm mostly going to focus on as one active area of research to understand the reason for remaining inequalities. So one can think of norms really as some sort of prescriptive construct. So for example, parenthood and the long hour culture would not be a women's problem if the gender roles were equalized in the household. In other words, work-life balance consideration would not be perceived as a women's problem if social norms didn't induce an equal role in the households. So similarly, one can make the same argument for educational choices. Different choices made by men or women in education or careers could simply reflect stereotypes about gender-specific skills and roles. So one can think of norms as this kind of social prescriptions that define what is appropriate and inappropriate for men and women to do in the household, in society, in the labor market. So for example, the male breadwinner model has clear prescriptions for the gender roles in the family, and there can be psychological reputational costs associated to breaking a certain norm. So for example, a man who earns less than his wife might find it less acceptable to himself or to society than a man who's a breadwinner. Sometimes the norms stem from deeply rooted intrinsic beliefs, but very often the origin of norms is relatively simple. The origin of stereotypes is simply the need to make a generalization and need to simplify and save on cognitive effort, even if the generalization is not necessarily accurate or rational. So this could lead to implicit association. So if I see a woman, I may think of a carer. If I see a man, I may think of a leader, just to give a very stereotypical example. Even though, as I've just shown from the data on self-esteem, the overlap between the distribution of traits between men and women is so large that perhaps it doesn't make much sense to think about average differences. So funnily enough, Oriana, I was thinking exactly about the same vignette that you showed, because this was really kind of very catching. So not only because of the way in which the government was thinking of us staying home, the husbands on the sofa, the wives doing chores, childcare, and homeschooling, but also because there is really an intergenerational transmission of norms. There's girls doing the mopping, not boys doing the mopping. So the key question here is whether indeed we can think of a role of policy. Why? Because gender norms vary widely across countries. So one very simple way of measuring norms is to measure the share in the population who believe that a woman who has preschool children should stay home as opposed to working in the labor market. This share has been measured in standardized data across the whole world. And then you would be surprised about the variation across countries. So for example, in the UK, the share of people who believe so is about 30%, but in Italy is like 70%. In Denmark is like less than 10%. And this is only about rich countries. If you move to Middle Eastern countries, for example, in some countries, there are up to 80% of the population think that the place for the women should be the home. And what is the bearing of all this for gender outcomes? So here I'm borrowing a graph from the joint work of Camille and Henrik that is showing the correlation between two very important measures of inequality. On the horizontal axis is the percentage of the population who thinks that women with children should stay home. On the vertical axis is the earnings penalty from having children. As you can see, there is a very clear positive association between these two indicators of inequality. So there are countries with relatively gender unequal norms like Germany and Austria, in which like 40% of the population thinks that women should stay home, and the motherhood penalty is between 50 and 60% of earnings. And then there are more gender equal countries like Denmark and Sweden, in which the motherhood penalty is only 20%. Only 20%. It's still a huge number. So what is the role of policy? Is there anything that policy can do about gender roles? Now, one can think of two types of policy questions. Well, first of all, can policies, regular policies like, for example, family policies, support equal gender roles? So the idea is that policies consistently supporting more equal gender roles between parents may eventually ease the change in gender norms and attitudes. So, for example, childcare subsidies, equal subsidies for parents, these are all gender-neutral policies that could encourage female participation of women to the labor market. Or one can think of even sort of counter-stereotypical policies, like, for example, daddy's quotas in parental leave. Now, one key issue with the effectiveness of those policies is that they may have kind of limited traction in cases in which conservative norms are deeply rooted in society. For example, in conservative countries, families might be unwilling to substitute maternal childcare with state-provided childcare because they think that mothers do it better. And fathers might be unwilling to take up parental leave because of reputational concerns. So in a sense, this is promising, but waiting for norms to evolve following gender-neutral family policies may take a very long time. Another sort of proactive view, more proactive view, would be to think of policies that directly counter-stereotype the norms, that introduce sort of counter-stereotypes in the information. So here, for example, there is a clear role for the education system and the media. So both the education system and the media can play a role in both reinforcing or breaking the stereotypes. So we've just seen the vignette for the stay-at-home advice given by the government. But then, for example, we can think of opposite cases in which, to give an example, the UK has regulated the advertising industry in 2018 by banning adverts with stereotypical content. So it's not possible to show, for example, in an advert, men and women failing at a certain task simply because of stereotypical images. So it's not possible to show a man who is like incapable to change a diaper. Now, in general, as I was saying before, it's typically an uphill battle to break stereotypes and to break gender norms whenever those have really deep intrinsic roots. But just to end on a more positive note, the outlook for policy is more optimistic in cases of so-called pluralistic ignorance. These are situations in which individuals personally would reject the norm, but they think that most other people in their circle, they do embrace the norm. So in order to have social acceptance and to avoid social stigma, they avoid a certain behavior, even if they don't find anything wrong with that behavior. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of the importance of this kind of misperception of social norms. One comes from Japan. So Japan has 12 months of paid paternity leave. This is the longest in the OECD. And nevertheless, only 6% of fathers applied for leave. And when they do, the median application is less than 1 week. So this sounds like crazy. And then survey evidence shows that a lot of this behavior is really driven by exaggerated image concerns rather than those fathers believing that taking paternity leave would be in contrast with their sense of self. And now all the examples I've given so far refer to rich countries. I want to give a sort of relatively optimistic example from a very conservative country in Saudi Arabia. So the evidence here comes from a social experiment that investigate the norm that women should work in the household and not in the market. This is particularly important in Saudi Arabia because the norm, but not the law, prescribes that husbands should give permission can or may not give permission to their women working outside the household. So husbands' belief about appropriate behavior determines their wives' labor force participation. So what shapes the husband beliefs? In a social experiment, 87% of participants agreed, male participants, agreed that that is sort of appropriate for women to work outside the home. It should be allowed for women to work outside the home. So it's not too conservative after all. But these same people believe that only 63% of their peer group agrees. So there is a clear role of information here because the support for labor force participation is vastly underestimated. So what the experiment does, they do an information treatment. So they provide the correct information on the beliefs of the peers to half of this group, and then they look at the behavior and the beliefs after that. So after there is this kind of information treatment, the same men are asked to pick a sort of thank you gift for participating to the survey. This could be a sort of Amazon voucher, a sort of online voucher, or it could be the voucher for enlisting your wife for a job finding agency that trains women to find job, and it's especially devoted to the female labor market in Saudi Arabia. So these two choices denote very different norms, very different beliefs and preferences about the role of women. As you can see from this graph, 23% of the control group choose to go for the job search agency. And instead, 32% of the treated group, the group that got the sort of correction of their beliefs, choose to go for the job search agency. So it seems that just providing the correct information, we are not inventing anything here, simply providing the correct information sends more women to search jobs in the formal labor market. And then finally, what is the impact in the very long run? I mean, this is just what happens at the end of the experiment. In a follow-up survey 6 months later, you see that wives of treated men who got the correct information, are much more likely to apply for jobs, are more likely to be interviewed for those jobs, are more likely to be employed in the market, and which is something characteristic to Saudi Arabia, are more likely to take driving lessons because driving was forbidden for women in Saudi Arabia until very recently. So on this kind of positive note, I will conclude. I hope I haven't taken too much time. Thank you very much for participating to the survey.
Thanks a lot, Barbara. Before I turn to Henrik, I just wanted to remind you that you shouldn't be shy. You should already ask your questions in the Q&A, and in particular because the more questions I have already before we start the discussion, the better I'm going to be at collecting them in a way that makes sense for our panelists. So please do not hesitate. I think there is already a lot of food for thoughts in Barbara's presentation, so I'd be surprised if you don't already have a lot of questions for them. So yeah, let's turn now to Henrik. So clearly Barbara pointed to one key dimension of persistence in gender inequality, which is children. So yeah, wait, you tell us a little bit more about what we know now of the impact of children.
Absolutely, yeah, Barbara, that was actually really helpful. You kind of introduced a lot of the things or some of the things that I will talk about. So that makes my job easier. First of all, I just wanted to thank you for inviting me to participate in this event. It's always wonderful to be back at the LSE, from where I have fond memories and where, as Camille pointed out, my career peaked before moving to the US. I think this hub is obviously a timely and amazing initiative, how to improve the representation of women and other minorities in the labor market is obviously at the forefront of both the public debate at the moment and also academic research. I'm, by the way, also impressed by your acronym, which I think is really good. It actually led me to maybe waste half an hour yesterday thinking about whether I could come up with a non-binary acronym instead. So I was working on they and them, but I got stuck. So the hub for equal, and then I got stuck at M and Y and couldn't really make progress from there. But anyway, I greatly admire your acronym. Okay, so I will talk a little bit about child penalties. As Oriana mentioned earlier, us academics cannot really talk without slides. but I'm actually going to make an attempt, although it makes me a little uncomfortable. I'm basically going to center my brief discussion here completely around a set of questions similar to questions in the same style that Barbara just asked. So my focus will be on the impact of children and parenthood on the observed inequality between men and women in the labor market. So as both Oriana and Barbara mentioned, a key concept for that discussion is the idea of the child penalty, also known as the motherhood penalty. So the impact of having children on the labor market outcomes, such as earnings or employment, on women relative to men. By how much do women fall behind men in the labor market as a result of having children? So Camille and I have done quite a bit of work on that in the last few years, and we will continue to work a lot more on that in the coming years. So I'm going to ask a set of questions for you to sort of get a sense of your beliefs about child penalties, their variation across geography, their magnitudes, and some of the possible drivers of them. So, so let's start with your beliefs about the geographic variation in child penalties. So maybe we can get the first question up, and then I will just read it to you. So the first question is: the child penalty, also known as the motherhood penalty, measures the percentage impact of having children on the labor market outcomes, such as earnings or employment, of women relative to men. In what parts of the world do you think that child penalties are the largest? So if you could answer your question on this one, that would be wonderful. So we have Scandinavia, Central Europe, Asia excluding China, China, North America, Latin America, and Africa. And so I will wait for your answer on this one before continuing.
Yeah, I think we're good, no, Lubara? Maybe we can, yeah, perfect.
All right, so then we get the answer here. So let me first report your answer. I'm not going to give the correct answer yet. I'm going to give you another question first, but so it seems that you're widely dispersed here. So we're not too far from randomness here on average. You do agree that China is probably not the likely answer, and Scandinavia is also not the likely answer. So so Central Europe, so that would be countries like Switzerland, Austria, Germany. Asia, including China, North America, and Latin America are the leading explanations here, with North America being the one that gets the largest number of votes. Now, before giving you the right answer, I want to flip this question around and ask you the reverse, namely, in what parts of the world do you think child penalties are the smallest? So we can get that question up. I don't want to reveal the question to the first one because that's going to help you with the second one. All right, so where do you think child penalties are the smallest? And the choices you have are the exact same ones.
That's good. I love this question. It works well. Very well.
All right, so we had North America number one on the first one, and then we had
Yeah, I think we can hand poll here. Perfect.
all right, so here you are very correlated in your beliefs. So most of you agree that, or 69% think that Scandinavia is where child penalties are the smallest, and that number two here is is Africa. So, okay, so let me reveal the answers. You're quite far off what is the right answer. So child penalties are the largest in Latin America. If we stay at the level of the continent, certainly Latin America has the largest child penalties. Child penalties are also large in Central European countries such as Switzerland and Austria, and parts of Germany. And they're also large in some parts of Asia, especially when we exclude China. So that's quite different from your leading contenders were North America was number one. Many of you did have Central Europe and Asia. Quite a few people also thought Africa. Africa is definitely not the right answer to where child penalties are the largest, but it is the right answer to where child penalties are the smallest. Again, at the level of the continent, Africa has the smallest penalties, along with China. There would be equally correct answers to that question. Child penalties are also small in some other specific countries in Asia. For example, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos have relatively small child penalties. So you'll see China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, they're all communist countries, by the way, and that's a general phenomenon that current or former communist countries tend to have small penalties. The same is true of East Germany. Cuba has relatively small penalties, and so does Russia. Okay, so this was sort of the geographical variation. Then the next question is, what are the magnitudes of these child penalties? So let's get the next question up. The next question will focus on Latin America. So this is where child penalties were the largest, but let's get your beliefs on what you think the magnitude is. So here I want you to focus on child penalties in employment. So by how much does the employment rate of women fall behind the employment rate of men as a result of having children? I want to focus on employment here because that is an outcome that we observe relatively well across a large set of countries. So it allows me to compare many different countries. So the choices you have here are less than 5%, around 10%, around 25%, around 40%, 50%, or more. So this is the causal impact of parenthood on the employment rate of women relative to men.
5 more seconds.
All right. All right, let's get the answer. Okay, so here the leading number here is 40%, followed by 25% and 50% more. So here you did a lot better. Of course, you had a bit of help because you know this is the largest, and you had seen some numbers before in Barbara's presentation, so maybe you could extrapolate a little bit. The right answer is indeed around 40%. So for example, in Argentina, the child penalty in employment is 45%. In Mexico, it's 42%. In Brazil, it's 38%. So it's around 40%, which is really a stunning number if you think about, because this is the employment rate, it's not earnings. So it's a pretty amazing number. Then let's turn that one around and get your beliefs on the magnitude of child penalties in a place where they are relatively small, namely Africa. So let's get that question up. What is the child penalty in employment in Africa? There we go. Same options.
Three seconds to cast your votes.
All right.
2, 1, done.
Okay, so here, 55% says around 10%, 29% says less than 5%. The right answer here is less than 5%. There is a qualification though. Child penalties are less than 5% in Africa when excluding the Northern African countries and South Africa. So where child penalties are really small is sort of in Central Africa, or really, Sub-Saharan Africa minus South Africa. That's where child penalties are less than 5%. They're larger in South Africa and in, for example, Morocco or Egypt. Child penalties are also less than 5% in China, for example, and in the Southeast Asian communist countries. In terms of the magnitude of penalties where they are large, I said they're around 40 to 45% in Latin America. They're also very high in Central Europe, 30 to 40% typically. They're also very large in specific countries in Asia, in the Middle East, which is perhaps not shocking news. They're also very high in South Asia. For example, an outlier in the entire world is Bangladesh, where the child penalty in employment is an amazing 60%. Okay, so now we got a sense of the variation in child penalties and their magnitudes across the world. A key reason why Camille and I mean, all of this is part of Camille, a project with Camille and Gabriel, where we're trying to create this child penalty atlas, really mapping out the variation in child penalties across the world. One of the key reasons why we're interested in that is that by getting estimates of child penalties for more countries, we will be better able to dig into the underlying explanations for the observed child penalties. So until this project, we primarily had evidence from a handful of developed countries with high quality data. But by mapping out these penalties across countries that have very different institutions, very different labor markets, very different policies, different social norms, etc., we can begin to think about, what factors are likely to be the key explanations. So my last question to you will be about that. What do you think is the key reason for the prevalence and persistence of child penalties and their variation across different parts of the world? So let's get up the last question. All right, so here you're getting only 5. I thought there would be more. We're missing some, but these are fine. So what are the main explanations for the presence and magnitude of child penalties? Pick your 2 preferred specifications from this list. And the first one is biological differences between men and women. The second one is differences in comparative advantage between men and women. So I want you to think of this as differences in childcare productivities and labor market productivities of women relative to men. Government policies, discrimination such as employer discrimination, and finally social norms and culture. This one does, but I'll come back to that when I have the answer. It's missing a couple to sort of make this complete. But you will just choose between these ones.
Three seconds.
All right.
1, 0.
Let's see it. Okay, so that's, so I think this is certainly an example of we have probably a selected sample of people in this particular event. And maybe you were also quite primed by some of the things that's been said in the previous presentations, because almost all of you think that social norms and culture is the main explanation. I don't think the beliefs would be distributed like this if you just sample a representative group of people. I think probably many people still believe that things like biology and comparative advantage are relatively important, and also that policies are quite important. But you favor the social norm explanation. So this is one where I'm not able to give you a conclusive answer at this point. This is the part of this research agenda where the hub is really important, because this is really work in progress. Really understanding the underlying drivers is it's a difficult question, and one where research is still in its infancy. Camille and I, and sometimes with other authors as well, have done a little bit of work on this, mostly trying to rule out some of the explanations rather than conclusively rule in explanations. So one thing where I think we have relatively good evidence in terms of ruling something out is the biological explanation. One very basic way of seeing that is to just think about the enormous spatial variation in child penalties that we've just looked at. If we thought biology were the main driver of this, we would not expect to see such strong spatial variation in the magnitude of child penalties. We also have some evidence ruling out comparative advantage between men and women as a key driver. I agree with you that one of the hypotheses that I find most interesting and credible is the social norms one. There is another one that wasn't part of these choices that I think is also very important. That has to do with labor market structure and labor market equilibrium. So for example, when you think about these low penalties in Africa, we do want to think about the fact that that's just a very different labor market. You know, it's just very different to say being working as a lawyer in Manhattan versus working in a country that's mostly agricultural and have very high rates of self-employment and so on. And that has an impact on these observed child penalties. But this is one of the directions in which we want to go and where the hub will be extremely helpful. So my time is up and then some, so I do apologize if I went over time. I will stop here and leave the floor to Petra.
Thanks a lot, Henrik. That was great. So yeah, we're gonna now turn to Petra, and in particular, we want to know a little bit more about the specifics of what happens in academia. We've heard a lot about, you know, the fact that economics, but more generally academia, was not, you know, necessarily a great place for gender equality. So yeah, tell us a little bit more about what you've done on this.
Thanks very much. So we'll go back a little bit historically, which I think will be interesting. Well, I guess I wanted to say in terms of culture, and I think culture is definitely one of the things that we think about. We'll just think about basically one country here. And so we'll look at American scientists, and I like to think about this as our lost Marie Curies. So women continue to be heavily underrepresented in science, in particularly at the higher levels. And so I think this is consistent with what we've seen before. Like, these differences are actually not what we would expect. For instance, women are much more underrepresented in higher levels in Germany, where I'm come from, than in the United States, which is actually, curiously, is the main reason why I came to the United States, was because I didn't want to be in a system where I thought I would have a harder time. So I thought it would be easier in the United States for me. So there could be many reasons why women continue to be underrepresented in these upper levels of science. Could be structural discrimination, it could be discrimination, it could be a lack of female role models. It could also be kids. So essentially, mothers just like up to this time spend more time on childcare than fathers. And they do this even when their husbands are unemployed or even when they earn more. And so Camille and Henrik are kind of like role models in this literature, but they've mostly looked at earnings. So I think, as far as I can tell, so I'm relatively new to this literature and I'm coming from a different side. So most people look at earnings. And so what interests me is like, well, what's the underlying effect and what is the effect on productivity in particular? And so we really have super nice data on productivity, and we have very nice data on scientists. And so we can ask, like, what do kids do to productivity, and what do kids do the timing of productivity? And then we can link that, and we can say, like, okay, now what do these differences in timing of productivity do to tenure and participation in science? And I'll keep this super brief. I'll just show you some summary stats. So the data that we have are some, Camille already says I'm an economic historian, so a lot of what I do is I think of a really big question, and then I spend like 3 or 4 hours trying to collect data, and then I just hope I find something that's sort of publishable. So in this case, we collected this massively large data on American scientists. So I have information on 90,000 American scientists, including their biographical records. So this is a super famous, super important woman who I didn't know about before I started this research, Gertrude Elion. She is the one who actually made research on viruses a systematic thing. So before that, people would just kind of throw stuff at it. And then Elion was one of the people who said, like, hey, let's actually think about the virus structure, and then let's be very systematic about how we attack it. So I'll use her as a first example. So we know her name, which we use to infer her name and match her with patents and publications. We know her exact age. I know her birth date, which is going to be important because I can figure out how the productivity of women changes across the life cycle. And I know a ton of stuff about their career. So I know when they did their undergrad. This is another cancer researcher who got her undergrad degree at age 17. She got her PhD at age 34. She became an assistant professor 7 years later at age 41. I also know, this is really important, I know when they married, and I know how many children they had in 1956, which is when I observed them. So for each of them, I know when they got married, and I know how many kids they have. And for a subset, I also have matched them with the census, and I know precisely when their kids are born. This is another example of Juliana Tesoro. She came to the United States, and here's the first, I wanted to show you in one data point what we can do with this data. So we have these scientists, we know their life stories, we know their employment, we know when they got their PhD, we know when they got married, and we also know when they produce stuff. So Juliana Tesoro got married in 1943, I can see that here, and she had 2 kids. And then when you look at her productivity, it really wasn't so great while the kids were young. And then afterwards, it increases dramatically. And then she's actually productive quite late. So now I'm going to look whether this is actually whether this pattern that I showed you in one data point, whether that actually is something that we see more generally. And so we do see it. So I'm going to first show you patterns, and then I'm going to show you the exact same pattern in a different measure of productivity. So this is patents. Now, patenting is, like, I can tell you, is a very rare event. So these are like really sort of elite, like inventors, scientists who patent, like just between 1% and 2% of the population patent. But if you look at it, patenting, actually, there's a very well-known pattern of productivity, which is that scientists, when we think about people talk about productivity patterns over age, they say, like, okay, people, they get more productive until about age 35, and then they drop. So these are younger generations. People got the productivity pattern was younger back then for a number of reasons that I won't discuss right now. But essentially, men peak in their early 30s, and then kind of they decline gradually afterwards. These are fathers, but mothers have a very different pattern of productivity. So mothers, essentially, they are doing well. So the average mother, this red line here, the average scientist marries at age, the median scientist marriage at age 27. And so once mothers marry, and then the kids, actually, for scientists wait a while until they have their first kids. They wait on average for 3 years. So then when you see is like the productivity of mothers kind of like declines in their early 30s. So there's some noise here, but really there's something going on. And then after age 35, they pick up. So their productivity pattern declines in their early 30s, and then after age 35, it picks up, and they peak much later than men. So they peak in their early 40s. This pattern is unique to mothers. It's not a pattern that is shared by women, other women. So it could be that women just have a harder time getting promoted and they have to rely on different things. Maybe they have to rely on co-authors, but that cannot be the explanation. So this is really just unique to mothers. This peak in productivity is only driven by mothers. And then this is like, again, if you compare other women and men without children, they actually look remarkably similar in their age pattern. And if you look at fathers versus other men, fathers are consistently more productive than other men in terms of patterns. And if you had more time, I could tell you more about this, but essentially what I think is like they are pushed into something that makes money. It's like specialization, right? Patents bring you more money than publications. They'll publish a little bit. They're not positively selected, at least, on publications. But what's really interesting, so we show this pattern in patents, but I already told you patenting is a really rare event. So we were kind of worried that, well, maybe this is just something in patents. There's a lot of noise. And so we wanted to do this in another form of productivity. So we look at publications. And it's really striking that for publications, you see exactly the same pattern. The age pattern of publishing productivity is naturally different from the age pattern of patenting. So publishing is a lot gentler on getting old than patenting. So for patenting, you just really see for scientists, it goes up and it goes down. You can be productive as a scientist for a longer time. But again, what you see is that mothers have this unique pattern where their productivity declines basically, again, in their early 30s, exactly the same time as the patenting goes down. And then it recovers after age 30, and they again peak in their 40s. And again, this is unique to mothers. So no other demographic group has that same time pattern of productivity. And so when I presented this paper at first, like one of my very, 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 very senior colleagues said, oh, this is maybe just because you had so much time, women have so much time thinking about research when they take care of children. So my first reaction was a gaping mouth, but then I was looking at the literature, the labor literature, and it's like, well, actually, no, missing time in the labor market is really bad, but there's another explanation, and that's kind of what we want to kind of ask the questions on right now. Camille, could you run this? Do you want to run it? Or I can just go straight to the numbers if we don't have time.
It's up to you. It's true that.
Okay, let's go to the, because otherwise we won't have time for discussion.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I just show you. I think we all kind of know this already. So kids are a lot of work. Kids are disproportionately more work when they're younger, right? I mean, mine are 12 and 14. They're pretty chill at this point, but when they were not so chill, and when they're like 1, and then mothers do way more of that work. I mean, this is completely abstracting from actually like putting on an enormous amount of weight and like giving birth and all that. This is just the time spent on childcare when the children are young, and so mothers do twice as much of that as men, and it's like as fathers. So it's really, I think it's like the timing that we see. So we know that these women gave birth in their early 30s. Then they were unproductive for about until age 35, and then their productivity kind of slowly recovers. It really suggests that this is driven by kids. And then in the paper, we have we kind of model our event studies on the ones that Camila and Hendrik are doing. I don't have time to show you these, but essentially after marriage, our mothers are unproductive for a while, and then kind of their productivity increases afterwards. So what does that mean for tenure? Well, these are not causal effects, right? I'm not going to be able to show you anything causal on tenure, and this is of course a very touchy issue, so I'm going to be super careful. But what I can tell you is that the tenure penalty in our data is driven almost entirely by women with kids. So 27% of mothers are promoted to tenure, compared with 46% of women without children and 48% of men. So women who do not have kids get tenure almost at the same rate as women, as men. Then if you look at the timing of the speed of promotion, so we have this incredibly detailed data on when people become assistant professors, when they become associate professors and full professors and all that. So we can kind of figure out when they get tenure. And what we see is that mothers actually are doing quite well, the ones who survive to get into our data set, they do quite well in the first 6 years. But then, like, if you're not super productive as a mother in your early years, the profession or science is not forgiving. Academia is not forgiving. So basically what happens is that mothers, the probability that mothers get tenure drops off, whereas everybody else keeps going. And I won't have time to show you this, but it's actually, for married women, it's almost the same unless they're old enough, unless they're so old that they won't have kids anymore. So that is, like, I think, sort of suggestive that it's really like sort of this expectation, both having kids and the expectations of having kids, that hurts women in their tenure process. Mothers are also less likely to get on the tenure track, at least historically. So again, here, this is really important that we're looking at historical data. So mothers actually are much less likely to get a tenure track jobs. They're mostly hired as lecturers. And then I think with that background, it's even more surprising how productive mothers are. So this is like, this is sort of an event study. I wanted to just see, like, well, how does the timing of productive output change as people approach tenure and pass after they get tenure? And so what we see here is that for men, it's like their productivity increases up to tenure and then it stays flat. Like for mothers, and also for other women, you don't really see that change very much. And so mothers are actually more productive after they get tenure, which I think is related to just the timing of their productivity. So mothers are extremely positively selected in this data. Mothers in our database, they produce 2.5 times as many patents compared with other married women by age 27, which is the median age of marriage, and 5 times as many patents compared with single women. So to make it as a mother, to survive as a mother, you have to be like really, really, like at this period, exceptional. They're also positively selected in terms of publications. They publish 1.4 times as much compared with other women. Fathers are much less positively selected. They're not positively selected on publications. So nobody's going to marry you basically because you publish a lot. People may marry you and may become a father because you patent more. So maybe it's like wealth stuff. Then also mothers have to be more educated to get the same jobs. So women were more likely to get PhDs. Even I'm looking at a time when actually some programs actively excluded women from getting PhDs. People would still say like, oh, why are you getting a PhD? And also women spend less time in the labor market. So there are all these things weighing against them, and still mothers are more likely to get PhDs. So then I just want to tell you how women respond to this. They don't marry. 40% of female scientists marry compared with 80% of men. They are less likely to have kids. Just 22% of the female scientists have children compared with 74% of men. And then I think this is very nicely consistent with Camilla and Hendrik's work. It's like the first kid that matters. And I also have this in some other regressions. It's like conditional on having a kid, having another one is just like, is a wash. But it's really the first kid that hits people. So people, actually women, conditional on having a kid, women have almost as many kids as men. And then, so why do we care? Actually, well, we should care because like this is, if you think about the baby boom, when there's a lot of people who had kids, there were lots of scientists, actually also potential scientists who had mothers. And what we see here, this is the time of the baby boom years. So there's this huge cohort of mothers that are missing. So I think in terms of basically when there were lots of kids, in a period when there are lots of kids, there's these penalties killed, they kept a lot of mothers out of the scientific labor force. So the ones who are missing here, the scientists who are missing, and this is why we started writing the paper, it was like, what is going on here? What's going on with the women? That's the baby boom mothers. So they have more likely to have kids, and all of these women are missing from the labor market, which I think is actually helping to explain why science is so bad to this day, because what that means is you have like basically a generation of missing women. You have like fewer role models, and I think that's felt to this day. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Petra. We are a little bit over time already, and I apologize for this, but I, didn't feel like cutting you because we're learning so much from this. This is really great stuff. I wanted to thank everyone for contributing in the Q&A as well. There are a lot of extremely good questions. What I suggest is maybe we collect. There are a bunch of really interesting questions. And they are all related to everything we've just said, and they also make a perfect segue to the next panel. So if we take maybe like 2 minutes to answer these questions, and they all go back to the question of, well, the organization of work. It seems like a lot of the penalty in these women in science has to do also with the fact that our tenure clock is extremely greedy, and we have questions from Mary but also from Lara, which are all going in the same direction, which is, well, but should we also be thinking about reorganization of the workplace as well? And what would be the type of interventions, what would be the type of initiative that companies or sectors or industries should do in that respect? If any one of you wants to answer briefly this question, and then we close the panel.
Camille, if you like, I can kickstart and then very briefly. Is that okay?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
So I think that was a very interesting question because it really relates to everything we've been discussing. So Petra, Henrik, and myself. So what can we do about the organization of work to remove the remaining barriers to gender equality? Now, this is really something about which like lots of people have been talking about. So the idea is that perhaps work has been organized. So the modern structure of work has been in place for decades, and it was largely designed by men when only men were at work, and specifically only men were in leadership positions. So this reflects stereotypical sort of preferences and traits of men. So perhaps if we could make the workplace more female friendly, we could help with gender equality. A sort of extreme view on this perspective, if I can add, is that this is perhaps trying to tackle the consequences rather than the root of the problem. If we agree that the root of the problem is about differential gender involvement in caring responsibility and household roles. So in a sense, if we change the labor market in such a way that matches exactly the differential responsibilities of men and women in the household, we just keep the inequalities as they are. We simply basically offset what happens in the household with something that we can do in the labor market. So specifically, I would think that it would be a lot more equal and also a lot more efficient. Of course, it's not very easy to intervene on the root of the problem, which is the differential role of especially fathers and mothers, more than sort of childless men and women in the household.
Excellent. Henrik, Petra, do you want to add a very small comment?
The one thing I would say is just like, if you're looking for a workplace policy, just make it really, really easy for women to come to work and drop off their kids and have high quality childcare, like right where they work. That's like, I think we know that if they do actually a lot of work, and if they're sort of supposed to do a lot of the work, just make it very easy to just bring the kid there, especially when they're really young.
Excellent. Henrik, no?
I mean, I'll save my comments maybe for later if there's time. Okay. We're quite, since we're behind
indeed.
time.
Also feel free to answer the Q&A in the Q&A boxes. You can as well type some answers to this. I think that would be nice. I need to close that panel now, but I just wanted to thank you again, all three of you, for these great presentation and great contribution to that debate. And now I want to turn to Nina, who's going to be going into the workplace and trying to change it.
That's a large agenda. All right. Well, thanks a lot, Camille. It was super interesting first panel. Thanks, everybody. I learned a lot. So let me just, kickstart the panel that I'm leading here with a few words of introduction about its broad goal and obviously about the wonderful panelists that we have today. So at the heart of the Hub's mission is this idea that there can be very fruitful synergies between academic researchers on the one hand and private actors on the other hand to generate insights on what it takes to build a workplace that works for all. Now, reflecting this goal on this panel, there's going to be a melting pot of researchers, private sector HR leaders, and also independent body experts, which will share their experiences on the ground and discuss how collaborations between researchers and private firms has led to the co-creation of knowledge, as Nava will discuss in much more detail in a couple of minutes. All right, so let me just give a brief introduction of our panelists today. So Nick Dalton, who I think is right there, yes, has worked at Unilever for more than 30 years and essentially, I think, contributed to all the possible HR functions at the firm. He recently was VP HR for Unilever's global supply chain and later EVP for global business partnering. In these roles, he essentially got to shape Unilever's labor, human rights, and D&I agenda. He was also one of the main actors in the partnering with LSE researchers to produce the evidence on the talent gap that Minouche described in the introduction note and that I think Nava will touch on in a couple of minutes again. Nick is finally the author of what I would qualify as a brilliant book on the future of HR, and we'll get to discuss it in much more detail today. We also have on the panel Claire Tunley, who is currently the CEO of the Financial Services Skill Commission, an independent body that focuses on building skills in the financial sector. In this role, Claire has notably overseen the publication of research on the barriers to women's participation in work. More broadly, Claire has worked in skills and economic development in both local and central government roles for over 20 years, and we're very lucky to have her in this panel today. The third panelist is going to be Sam Friedman. She's the Senior Vice President of People Strategy at H.E.R, which is a leading online recruitment platform for tech and sales workers with whom I've had a partnership to produce research for the last now 4 years. Sam currently specializes in developing and leading the HR teams in areas such as employee relation and engagement, as well as talent acquisition. Prior to joining Vettery, she actually developed the HR strategy and people analytics function for Penguin Random House, which, by the way, has published some of my favorite books. So not part of this conversation today, but we'd love to talk about this some other time. Our last but not least panelist is Nava Ashraf. Nava is a professor of economics at the LSE, as well as the director of research of the Marshall Institute. Covering all our areas of expertise would take me more time than the hour we have for this panel. So for the sake of brevity, I'll just highlight that her research applies insights essentially from psychology and economics to understand decision-making. She, for instance, recently used these tools to open the black box of intra-household bargaining or to understand how to bolster female entrepreneurship. Nava, you're going to be the first talking today. So you have experience, years of those experiences partnering with private firms and producing research that's at the frontier with these partners. So I thought we could start this panel by asking you to provide some of your insight of your experience in what you kind of call co-creation of knowledge.
Sure. Thank you so much, Nina. And it's such a pleasure to be with all of you here today. Really fascinating conversation so far. Let me, can everyone see my slides? Great. Okay, so just on this kind of model, I think a lot of this comes from this idea that we generally have thought about scientific knowledge as something that is the purview of something that's created by academics. And even if we kind of have them come down from the ivory tower, they are still the ones producing scientific knowledge. And the idea is that this scientific knowledge is supposed to inform and impact policy and practice on the ground. The problem is that actually there's a big gap in how much of that knowledge actually makes its way into practice, of course. But then the other difficult part is that practitioners themselves are also generating a lot of valuable knowledge, and that knowledge is also not making its way back into science. So we have two sources of loss of knowledge in society. The challenge is, how do we overcome this? And, in the past, especially, so a lot of this work in the cogeneration model came out of working with governments. And, we had tried very much to develop a whole cadre of people who could communicate scientific results to policymakers. But that still had many gaps. So instead, we've sort of developed this model together with a number of national governments, and now with several large multinational firms, that requires, in some sense, these academics and practitioners, for all of us to come down from our perches, our particular sources of what we think kind of important causal knowledge is, our languages, et cetera, and to be able to develop and build this usable scientific knowledge together. And in my experience, the difficult part of this is twofold. One is how to reconcile the expectations of timing, because often in managerial policy and practice, if a company or a government is about to roll out something, they don't have enough time to do the kind of very careful work that an academic would like to do. So instead, you really want to be thinking about the long-term horizon. And the other is actually just conceptually to get beyond the perceived trade-offs of what is frontier knowledge and what is policy relevant knowledge. So often we think about policy relevant knowledge as something for consultants to do. And with companies, I think this is a new realm also, to be able to think about how to really partner with academics, not as consultants for a question that they have for immediate managerial policy, but as people who develop knowledge. So as Oriana described, we want to come up with the questions together. I'm going to give you an example of that, but several others that have come out of that. But then there's many other parts of it, which are first to share the data and results all along the way. The hard part about that, the great part, is that it can start to actually make its way into policy, that it doesn't have to lead to the very, after 3 or 4 years of having some results, you have some dissemination, and then eventually there's a change in some kind of policy. But rather that it's all along the way. And people feel like it's data that they can trust, that it's not data that was somehow kind of manufactured in some other way somewhere else. The difficult part is how to maintain the intellectual integrity. And that's something that, actually with the firms that I'm going to talk about today that we've had the partnerships with, we worked for many years with the general counsels of both those firms and of LSE to have legal agreements in place that we are allowed to basically come up with and publish whatever results arise. That requires the firms themselves to be really committed to knowledge. And it's great that Nick is here, because Unilever is certainly one of those firms that is wanting to learn, and then through that learning be able to impact practice in their field. Finally, even as the research starts to feed into policy, what's really fascinating as a researcher is how much, when you have those conversations, and I'll share one example of that, with the firm or the partner, of what you're finding, their comments actually will feed into new research questions. Okay, so I'm going to focus here in this panel on diversity, which is, has been the subject of large body of kind of creating the business case for diversity. But that hasn't had as much of an impact on practice as one would think. And I would posit that a lot of that is because the work has actually not been very rigorous. And so we actually have very little work on the true economic impacts of diversity, however you want to define that. I'll talk a little bit about this literature. So very quickly, I'm going to tell you about one of our collaborations, which was on gender roles and misallocation of labor. And this was what Manish mentioned at the beginning, but basically the underlying point is that, as we've heard in the last panel, most countries are very far from gender parity in the allocation of work inside and outside the home. There's a lot of reasons why this could be the case. And we could think about this being, very historical for a good sort of rational reason when physical strength was most important for work outside the home. But the norms and the practices have far outstripped the original rationale that created them, as we've seen earlier. Now, the interesting thing is, given all of this historical precedence, is the allocation we see today simply something that actually has a comparative advantage, has developed a comparative advantage over time? And then what that would tell us is that actually the current allocation is optimal. I know that in this conference we would not like to think that, but it's important to entertain this possibility that over time we have developed a comparative advantage across genders. And if that's the case, then if we were to reallocate women more into the workforce and men into homes, we would actually not have any impact on efficiency. Or if that's a result of difference in barriers. So that, in fact, the ability distributions across men and women are the same and have remained the same, but women have faced higher barriers. In that case, women's talent would be misallocated, and there would be an increase in productivity and national income from a reallocation. And so what we do in this paper, I won't go into a lot of depth, but we combine the personnel data of this multinational firm, which is 60,000 employees over 100 countries, with the differences in female labor force participation across countries and cohorts in each of these countries. What we find is that countries with low female labor force participation are countries where the gender norms are the worst and the barriers women face to entering the workforce largest, as we would expect, right? So the social norms line up exactly as you would think with the female labor force participation. Then we ask, within the same firm, for the same job, with the same qualifications, what does the gender wage gap, by which we mean the women's wages minus men's, look like for those countries? What we find is that the gender wage gap is positive. That is, women's wages are larger than men's wages for the same job with the same qualifications. And the gender wage gap grows, by which we mean the positive gender wage gap grows, the lower is the female labor force participation. Which means in those countries with the lowest labor force participation, those are the countries with the highest barriers to entry for women. Who are the women who are able to make their way into the labor force? The women that have the highest ability, who can actually overcome those barriers. They are the only ones who could actually make it into the labor force. And that gives you a little bit the logic of how many talented women are left at home and out of the labor force. And then we take that logic into many different steps and use a structural model to kind of think about what would happen if we took away those barriers and replaced the norms that keep women out of the workforce with gender neutrality, giving an average productivity increase across these countries with lots of variation, but almost every single country that we study would have an increase in productivity on average at 32%. Now, let me tell you what happened when we talked to the firm about these results, which was really fascinating. The first thing they said was, wow, we actually thought, and I know the first question on the Q&A was, what are the most impactful gender equity things that we can do at work? And when they saw these results, the first thing they said was, well, our initial policy of actually having firing be equal across genders would be very problematic. So we have thought of that as gender equity to make sure that all that who are fired is 50-50. But in fact, if there are more talented women who are actually in the labor force in our companies, and we actually enforce a 50-50 gender equity on firing, that would be very problematic. And so it's a nice way to show that the intuition around what we might think is gender equity could actually really hurt women. And the second thing they said was, what would it be like if managers could see these results? Because what these results say is when you look at someone who's a rise at your in your team, for example, has kind of made their way into your labor force, if they are in a minority, and that I think the logic of our paper definitely applies not only to women, but anyone you see who would have had to overcome barriers in order to show up. So if they're a minority, they likely had to overcome barriers in order to show up, and they likely might be more talented than you might think. Because the truth is, from the psychological basis, we often are biased to thinking that people who come from our schools or the places we know are probably, we have an assessment on their talent, and much less so on people we don't know or who come from different backgrounds. This suggests that, in fact, those people might be far more talented than we might think. So the firm said, why don't we actually try to think about that? So we might actually be able to, this is how this kind of policy could actually change it and bring its way back into research. We are talking now with the firm about teaching managers about certain aspects of this research and then seeing if that affects how they treat diverse members of their team. The last bit I want to just touch on is the impact of diversity, not only on kind of individual productivity and who shows up. So this paper was really about selection, but what happens when you put diverse people together in a team? And here I really want to say, despite the fact that, this panel is all about the great diversity and inclusion in companies, and there is good evidence on the benefits of diversity for economic growth, on innovation and patents, for example, there's some also good microeconomic theory on the channels through which diversity may benefit performance in organizations. There's very little good empirical evidence of whether and how diversity actually affects performance. And I would put forward that we need to be very honest about the actual costs of diversity on functioning. And here I want to highlight two of a current wonderful PhD student at LSE, Virginia Meany, and a previous PhD student, Alexia Delfino, who is now an assistant professor at Bocconi. And they both worked with two of the firms that we have been working with on this research agenda. And in two very different firms, so we've got basically Unilever and multinational bank, they found very similar results. So on the first one, this was on cultural distance. So again, you can think about diversity in many ways: skills diversity, cultural diversity, values diversity. Virginia's paper found that cultural distance between managers and employees increased communication and coordination costs. And Alexia found, by carefully measuring values between managers and employees separately, that a misalignment in values between employees, colleagues, and top management negatively correlated with individual and team level performance, and a lower intention to stay. So I don't think we can take for granted that diversity can improve performance, but we can actually think that there is great value to be unlocked. So how do we unlock that? One of the things that we've been talking about, particularly with Unilever, is to kind of look for what we call positive deviance. Managers who have done a really good job of unlocking the value of diversity on their teams and finding that sort of innovation and creativity have gone up when they've had more diverse team. Who are these managers, and what are the skills they're using to create a more inclusive workplace, and in particular to allow diversity to lead to greater creativity and innovation. So that's to come, and I'll just stop there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nava. That was really enlightening. And I suppose it's a really good segue that's the question you asked about how to unlock the value of diversity at work, because it is at the heart of the book that Nick co-authored that's called H.E.R. Revolution, Change the Workplace, Change the World. In this book, Nick essentially identifies the underlying values that have driven H.E.R. policies and approaches to D&I. And Nick, in this book, you describe 3 pillars of the future of H.E.R., starting with what you describe as change the way we change. Can you tell us a little bit more about these pillars, and specifically, given the topic of this panel, how they relate to the hiring and retention of a more diverse workforce?
Nina, thank you. And thank you everyone for inviting me here. I have to start with an apology, actually, because the survey that was done earlier about typically white middle-class men speaking very, very confidently, even if they have no grounds of thorough research or data. Well, that's going to be me now, because I've just watched all the presentations that have just happened. And I have to say, my book is made up of anecdote, experience, and my own worldview. So when I do talk as if what I'm saying has a 95% statistical significance, please get past your irritation and realize it's just, I'm afraid, my value system and gender coming through. There's two things I want to cover, I think. Firstly, I'm retired now from Unilever, but I was there 35 years. And I'd just like to sort of share with you the phases I saw as the company wrestled globally with issues around equality, diversity, and inclusion. And then once I've done that, just to give you some broader reflections actually around the book, because the book talks about different value systems that have underpinned how we've approached people management in the workplace since the Industrial Revolution. I'll do that very quickly. But the reason I'll do that is because then for me, when I think through those lenses, it sort of raises lots of questions and lots of things I'd love to see that the hub address and look for out of the research you're doing. So, I mean, to start with, when I started in Unilever, I started in Unilever in the mid-1980s. And at that time, the way we approached equality, because that's what we called it, was we obeyed the law. And that was it. And I think most companies did that in those days. In fact, lots of companies didn't even do that. And still we see companies doing that now. And obeying the law, it sounds like it's not much, but it is. For big companies, that involves resource being put in terms of monitoring, measuring, ensuring you're doing things correctly, ensuring your processes are in place, ensuring you've got all your risk management systems there. It takes some time, it takes some effort. You've got to put resource behind it. But a big company like Unilever in the 1980s would have done that. And we did. But we didn't think about the subject any more than that. Then in, I would guess, the 1990s, the mid-1990s, the war for talent arose. That's hit us, the war for talent. Suddenly the business realized, well, hang on a minute. Why are we ignoring half the population? So gender diversity became prominent. Why are we ignoring half the population? Why are we ignoring that talent when that talent's available? McKinsey at the time were very big on the war for talent, you know, the famous paper they wrote. So we were no longer just obeying the law. We were then preparing business cases to justify the case for diversity. And many people, there's probably not many people as old as me on this call, but those around will remember that. And that was a good thing, because what that meant was probably in management representation, we would have gone from having around 15, 20% female managers, those in the 1980s who were able to hack it, to be honest, to in the 1990s and 2000s, it got up to around 30, 35%. Because in some cases, in some parts of the world, business cases were made that justified investment around typically recruitment, typically retention, justified on the basis of the war for talent. And that was fine as far as it went, but it's still 30, 35% female representation in a consumer goods business that wasn't reflecting its consumers in any way, shape or form. In a consumer goods business where people still look like, you know, Don Draper from Mad Men, as opposed to the people who were buying the product. So this really didn't make a great deal of sense. And in 2008, a CEO called Paul Polman arrived, and he took the company very much back to its beginnings, which were very purpose-driven in Unilever, as is on the news at the moment. And he basically said, look, we're going to address gender diversity, not because there's a business case in it, there is, but because it's the right thing to do. And that sounds quite progressive, but in terms of actually HR practice, it was quite aggressive, because then we insisted on balanced slates. Every manager, every leader was targeted, and their bonuses depended on it. Now, people have different opinions on it, but I can tell you it worked. It worked. And we started to see our numbers really tick up in our management groups. So when I retired at the end of last year, Unilever was on 51% female leaders. Its top senior board was balanced. Real great work had been done in that area. But notwithstanding that, you still see certain drop-offs when what was it called earlier, the baby penalty comes in. You see that baby penalty drop off. Notwithstanding that, you also see, to Nava's point earlier, and you see it actually in Unilever's gender pay reporting. Unilever's gender pay reporting on median was -2%. So women in the median pay got paid more than men. But that's because not many women work in the factories. That's why most women work in management. So actually, it sounds good, but you see all sorts of paradoxes then emerging in terms of it's just about managers. It's not across the board. In the developing world, where increasing female representation, as again we've just seen, would make a massive difference, Unilever hasn't made the same strand yet in terms of representation. So this last phase, which the company was entering into as I retired, I saw the first three phases: the obey the rule phase, the war for talent phase, and the do it because it's the right thing phase. We're now really into the paradox phase, which is saying we're not going to solve this problem unless we start really addressing systemic issues. And I was fascinated, I think, the research I saw earlier, maybe Barbara would put up about Japan, which I wasn't aware of. With the law says a man can have 12 months paternity leave, but only 6% take it. Now, for me, that's really fascinating, because it really shows if you have a process organization that just obeys the rules, that means to say people will actually have the culture and the value system to move the thing forward. So those 4 phases I saw in Unilever on diversity and inclusion. And I think what I see when I speak to other companies and colleagues is I see companies still going through those 4 phases. Different companies are in each of those different phases. Within companies, different parts of the world are in different phases. Within each organization, different departments are often in different phases. Even if the policies are the same, the value system that underpins it is often different. And that leads me to the second point I wanted to address, which is around these underlying value assumptions that drive HR policy and practice. So because I come from a marketing company, we always like to put things in marketing speak. So in the book I co-authored, we spoke about 7 great waves of HR policy. It's obviously more complicated than that, but that's what we spoke about. And each of them surprisingly began with a P. Again, it's marketing. But I want to share them with you because it's the lens through which I think about these issues. And it's the lens I sort of make sense of what we could actually practically do when we get research and when we start working on this issue. So at the start of the Industrial Revolution, the first HR problem was, how do you get large groups of people to come to work every day and not be drunk? Because large groups of people didn't come together every day up until the Industrial Revolution, unless they were in the army. People used to work from home, ironically. So the answer to that was paternalism. You're part of the family, we'll build you a model village, we'll look after you. And the paternalistic policies, and Unilever was one of the forefronts of this model villages, the whole thing. And that worked until about, the dawn of the last century, no, century before last, when paternalists couldn't afford it anymore because of the booms and busts of the first capitalist cycles. So they started to cut all the nice conditions, and we went into the power era. Trade unions rose, we had the big leadership challenges, we had the conflict management, we had the birth of industrial relations. And that probably went through to the beginning of the Second World War, when after the Second World War, we all decided power leaders probably aren't such a good thing. And we went into the era of process. Governments started to regulate. We had sex discrimination legislation. We had equal pay legislation. We had things like job evaluation. We had things like wages policies. And we basically began a whole series of managing processes and managing rules and systemizing. And that in the 1980s fell away when we all decided that was too slow and too bureaucratic. And we went into the era of profit with Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan. And instead of managers having company cars, well, we had bonuses instead, and we had stock options instead of pensions. And instead of being managers, we were taken away and became transformational leaders. And that era of profit is, again, still very relevant. We saw in Unilever the people and purpose era come in 2008, which I think is the era now, post-COVID, many companies are toying with, where companies start to think about purpose, start to think about people in a very different way, start to think about diversity and inclusion and well-being, and have them as policy agendas. And as I said before, I actually think the leading edge companies are addressing paradoxes, because as Unilever are discovering now in terms of some of the challenges, when you talk about purpose, you get challenged. You get challenged because there's a say-do gap. There's a say-do gap often in terms of company performance, because there always can be. And there's a say-do gap also in terms of living your purpose, because you live in a complex system and a complex world. And actually having a nice purpose around social and labour standards is great. But having been responsible for labour standards in Unilever for many, many years, my word, it's hard, it's complex. So I think those eras of paternalism, power, process, profit, people, paradox, that's my simplification of the whole world. And when I listen around HR, when I listen around research, when I listen to leaders speak, when I think about what companies are doing, I think to myself, well, which one of those wave or waves are they, is their underpinning value system? And it was really interesting just to finish with that Japan example, because that's my big take. With the Japan example, we saw possibly a paradox wave type policy in a process wave type culture. So the issue is, how do these things align? How do you bring them and integrate them so that they actually are congruent, coherent, as opposed to all over the place, which often things can be when it comes to HR fashions. So there we are, and that's the quick download. So again, forgive me everyone for speaking so certainly about things that are clearly not right, but at least it's something that raises questions.
Oh, thank you so much. And usually it's women that apologize this longly for what they're saying. So it's nice to see for once a man doing it, I have to admit. If I was the one in charge of asking questions right now, I would have 10,000 of them, but this is not my role. So I will leave it to the audience to ask those questions. Like Camille said earlier, please start gathering your questions, sending them now, so we can bundle them all together and ask them at the end of the panel. Thank you so much, Nick. That was really enlightening. I think Nava earlier mentioned some research by previous students here at the LSE, Alexa Delfino, that was on or with a multinational bank. So this is, again, I guess a good segue to move to our next panelist, who is Claire Turnley, the CEO of the Financial Services Skill Commission. As the CEO of this commission, you've been overseeing HR practices in the banking sectors for many years. To kickstart our conversation, we actually have collected a couple of questions for the audience, notably to assess the gender pay gap in finance. So if Lubala, you could just put them up so we can ask them, and then we'll move forward with our panelists. Thank you so much. So yeah, that is it. Awesome. All right, I'll end it at 30 seconds, I suppose. So you have another 4, 3, 2, 1. And I guess I'm the one ending the vote. Camille, were you the one ending the votes? No. Okay, good. So end of the votes. Okay, so we have a pretty shared audience. I think this is close to the random answers from Enrique earlier. So we'll keep them in mind, and we'll actually answer the question a little bit later. Can we move to the second question, please? Here again, we'll keep a strict 30 seconds rule. So another 5 seconds to go. And I think we can close it now. Awesome. So essentially, most people seem to think only 10% of them mention menopause as the reason why they might retire. I think you will be surprised by the answer that Claire is probably going to give in her talk. So just to kickstart the conversation, Claire, I wanted to ask you broadly, about the main challenges for the firms in the banking sector in retaining and attracting diverse talents, and how this is impacting the female talent pipeline. And if you could, within the answer to that question, to the questions in that would be ideal. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much for handing over and for inviting me along today. I'll try and be brief because I know we're running out of time. Just so people are aware, the Financial Services Skills Commission is a membership body set up, and it's our members are financial services organisations, so covering banking, insurance, asset management and fintech. So our members include some very big names and small names: Zurich, Nationwide, Lloyds Bank, Aviva, these kind of organisations. And we cover over a third of the UK's financial services workforce across our membership. So that's over 300,000 people. The reason for setting up the commission was to respond to some of the skills challenges the sector's facing for the future, and really the fact that to remain competitive and innovative and productive for the future, the sector really needs to invest in skills. And that not only means in retraining and upskilling people, but also looking at attraction and retention of the talent that's already in the sector. And that's really where we focus our work. And it's interesting that people have touched on the business case, because we're very much around emphasising the skills and talent needs of the industry, and why firms need to act on issues such as inclusion and diversity to make sure that they can attract and retain that talent. We are not a think tank, we're not a research body, although we do research. We really support our members on actionable, practical content that they can then address some of the challenges that we identify. So I'll go through a few of the areas that we've certainly heard from our members around retaining and attracting talent, particularly around retention and particularly where it relates to female talent pipeline. I'm not going to talk much about the skills challenge, but there is a real war for talent going on out there. It's very acute at the moment, but it is not new. It's not just because of Brexit or the pandemic. It's been pre those two big changes. So firms are having to think a lot more carefully about how they can attract talent. Certainly top graduates from particular universities, etc., particular degrees, have a much more bigger options about where to choose they want to go, what sector they want to work in. They want to go into academia, for example. We start from a position in terms of gender in the industry as being fairly evenly split in terms of the overall workforce. But when we drill down into the detail, we see that seniority is very much not evenly split. A third of managers, senior managers are female, whereas half the workforce is female. And also location and job role as well, and different types of roles. So very much women are prevalent in customer service roles, whether that's retail bank branches or claims handling in insurance, for example. And typically those roles that are likely to be a threat in the future for redundancy, for example, if as automation progresses. But we're asking firms, how do we look at those skills and retain that expertise? Just to come back to the poll on the gender pay gap, so the correct answer was 28% for the industry. There is a lot of variation within the industry, so it's particularly higher in banking than it is in, say, insurance. So it's not, again, one picture, but it is one of the highest gender pay gaps of any sector in UK industry. The workplace culture is something that we talk a lot about at the Commission with our members. The perceptions of what the financial services sector working culture is, the actual realities of that, and actual working practices as well, because it does influence the choices that employees make. And I'll come back on to some of the things we're doing about that, but that's one topic that comes up. And the importance of leaders and managers in that workplace culture. So setting out a clear policy about what the workplace culture should be has to be reflected in reality of the experience of individuals. And I know from Nick nodding that that's something that HR grapples with a lot. How do you make that culture throughout the organisation? Work-life balance and hybrid working is a real issue that we talk about. There's obviously been a huge shift in the last 2 years. And as someone who's worked at home 1 day a week for many years pre-pandemic, I'm really glad that I'm now not the odd person who's working at home 1 day. Everyone thinks I'm skiving, because that's not the case. And I think what that has opened up is much, much more potential for different ways of working and different opportunities for people who maybe have thought they cannot manage how they want to run their life and working demands. Now we've got more options to look at that, which is fantastic. I've been fortunate, I've had supportive employers, but not all employers have had that view. I think that, you know, we're beyond that now, and there's a lot of potential that we can look at that as a way to have more inclusion within the workforce. One thing I wanted to talk about a little bit was some work we've done around the impact of the menopause, and we did see the poll there that I'll come back to in a second. So the menopause, we did some research which we published in October, and certainly happy for people to have the link or find it on our website. But this came from some anecdotal information we sort of found and conversations about women choosing to step back from a particular point in their career around the ages of 45 to 55. And for financial services, that's around 1 in 8 employees. That's over 100,000 women working in the sector. That's huge. That's a big talent pool that the employers cannot ignore. And what we found was that the lack of conversation, the lack of this being a taboo subject, meant that many women were trying to struggle with the menopause transition without any support. And actually, what we did find was that about a quarter, the actual figure from the poll there is 25% of women said the menopause is likely to make me want to retire early from the workforce. That's huge. That's a big number. And I don't think people realised when we started the research what an impact it could have. We also had another, there's 49% of people we interviewed indicated that it would make the menopause would make them less likely to step up to a senior role or to take on more responsibilities. And if we look at the representation of women in senior roles and on boards, that's typically the age at which you are likely to step up to that role. And if the menopause is making women step back and decide not to take that on, then that's something we need to consider. So it's an area that we are really pleased we did the research on, and there's a lot of detail in the work, which I could talk about forever, but that's a whole other webinar. But I do think this is one area that we maybe need to look at in more detail about participation, particularly at that older age group, although women can transition the menopause at any age. It's certainly not one size fits all. I think the other thing that some of the solutions that we're looking at with our members to support this is looking at inclusion. Diversity and data and collecting data and understanding your workforce is really important, but actually you want to have workplaces where people feel included, they want to stay and they want to work. So we've produced an inclusion measurement guide, and this takes firms through a maturity model about how they can approach inclusion, understand how people feel about working in their firm. And interestingly, when you look at the demographic data against the inclusion data, you can start to pick out where certain groups feel differently, and you can look at gender, you can look at age, you can look at ethnicity, depending how you cut it. So we really encourage firms to look at it from an inclusion point of view, not just the diversity data point of view. Things such as remuneration do play a huge factor in retention and people's desire to where they want to stay. I'm not going to cover that today, but we do talk about culture and inclusion and working practice, but let's not forget remuneration does have a big impact. One of the things that we hear a lot about as well is the clarity around career progression, particularly in financial services. The mystic arts of how you progress in some firms need to be broken down. What are those processes? What things do you need to have? If you want to be at this level in 5 years, what do you need to fill gaps in your CV to get there? Do you need to have overseas experience? Do you need to run a particular department? Do you need to run this project? And if the organisation is serious about that progression, putting in place those structured steps to help people get there. So we do hear a lot about that structured and open and clarity around progression and development and that pipeline. And we also talk about things such as reviewing those role requirements. Do you have to have 2 years working overseas to get to a senior role? And actually that would exclude lots of women who maybe are mothers at that time and can't do that, or could be men that are parents as well. So reviewing the role requirements, are they really what are needed, or are there other ways that people can demonstrate their expertise to get to that senior position? And finally, one thing that I know one of our members has done is look very closely at the wording in adverts, either external or internal adverts, and looking at is it gendered wording? Is it saying leadership and strong, or is it about more inclusive language that make women more comfortable to apply? Quite a lot of things there, but I will leave it there and take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. I really particularly enjoy that bit that you discussed about clarity on what it takes to go up the ladder. I think that kind of joins also some of the hub's focus on transparency of information. There's a lot of evidence out there that without that, women are at a disadvantage. And so this is certainly an area of research that we want to explore more. So thanks for bringing that to the discussion today. All right, so last but not least, let me turn to Samantha Freeman. So Sam, I'm super happy to have you today on this panel. For transparency, H.E.R.com and I go way back. We started partnering in 2018. Despite the lack of time, I will indulge in a little anecdote, which is that at the time I was a graduate student. I had what one would call zero track record as a researcher, and H.E.R. still trusted me with their data, invested time, resources in the production of academic research. And I think that's because the firm believed that documenting and solving gender inequities in salary negotiation was part of their mission. And now 4 years later, the partnership is still alive and strong, and we have a lot of projects in the pipeline that I'm super excited about. So I think at the beginning, Oriana mentioned a lot of the focus today was going to be solely about gender. And so for this last conversation, we thought we would shift gears a bit and actually broaden a bit the conversation, looking at racial inequities on the labor market. So for people who don't know what H.E.R.com is, maybe I should have said that once more. It is an online recruitment platform specifically for tech and sales workers. And so without further ado, I'll just let you tell us a little bit about this yearly report that H.E.R. does specifically on racial disparities in salaries and in work experiences.
Thank you, Nina. And we're so proud of our partnership with you. And thank you for having me as a panelist today. So, when we looked at our 2020 wage gap report, what we really saw was that progress is being made and the wage gap is narrowing, but we still have quite a long way to go. And we saw a gap across all available representation of our data. So gender, race, age, sexuality, and education. And one of the main highlights that we really found is that underrepresented groups can really be stuck in a cycle of lower pay if they have no way of truly knowing how much they deserve in compensation for a role. If they're asking for less, right, it results in less pay. And so as we kind of dove into that data and we saw underrepresented groups such as Black women asking for less, we saw that they get paid less. And so what I know it was earlier mentioned in the talk as the ask gap, we talk about it very frequently as that expectation gap, right? And we see this as being a clear driver and result, which, ties and correlates to the wage gap. And so on average, Black candidates saw wages that were 4% less or lower than the baseline in 2020 versus 5% in 2019. So sure, there's a small marginal increase there, but by contrast, Asian candidates, they really saw no change between 2019 and 2020. And they received offers that were actually 1% lower in 2020 than in 2019. And so white, Hispanic, multiracial candidates, they receive proportionally more interview requests as well on our platform. So significant, 4 to 16% more on average. And we still see the Asian and Black candidates on our platform receiving fewer requests, and especially within the Asian candidate pool that actually see 9% less than the white, Hispanic, or multiracial candidate. So we definitely see race being that contributes significantly to the expectation gap, but that's most prevalent in minority women compared to white women or minority men. And, I think it highlights it. So as we looked through our data, as we went through sample set, what we saw was that Black women actually expect salaries that are 10% lower than their male counterparts. And I think there's actually interesting research that we've done with Nina before where during the process, we actually on our platform started pre-populating fields with the average or median rate of that job posting. So for a senior software developer, maybe we went ahead and pre-populated that date. And we saw that had a significant impact in what these candidates were then asking for, right? Because generally what we found was when we began pre-populating that median data, our candidates began asking for that. And so the expectation and that ask gap really did level out. One other thing that we think is really important and something that we think through is when people of color or minorities or underrepresented groups find that they are making less than those in their position, right? And they surface those complaints to HR or to their people team. They see salary increases maybe 20 or 15% of the time. For Black candidates, about 20% of the time. Hispanics, they see about 15%. Whereas white counterparts, they're receiving that bump and that correction at 28% of the time. And so for us being able to surface up this data, being able to create transparency within this market, we feel like there's a ability for us to have a real impact in making pay more equitable, which is what we aim to do through not only this report, but we also have annual salary calculators and other tools available on our website for any candidate, regardless, if you're on our platform or not, to access.
Awesome. I think just we have a couple more minutes, so I will indulge in another question. I know that in the pipeline of projects that we have together, you started developing what you call diversity goals that help surfacing URM candidates. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And if you have time, a tool that I like also is the H.E.R assessment, which focuses on skills rather than the resume.
Absolutely. So, I think the way that we see ourselves, we are a company that provides diversity and recruiting and hiring tools, not only for Fortune 500 firms, but all the way to growing startups. And so we have this vision that we need to create a world where hiring is equitable and efficient. And to do that, we have different tools available. So that could be our bias reduction feature, right? It's a toggle where basically our platform masks candidates' demographic details so that we can really help reduce the unconscious bias in the hiring process. We have these salary bias alerts, which what it does is it really provides compensation transparently, both on the perspective of the candidates on the platform, but more importantly, also for the employer. And so I think an interesting alert is what happens is if we see an employer making an offer that is below the median request, or we see a candidate ask for something below the median request, we actually nudge either side of the platform to let them know about this inequity. And what we see is that these nudges are actually, they drive incredibly, they can be impactful, right? So when those nudges actually lead to a change, offers are, the average is about a $20,000 US dollar change. That's quite impactful and significant, and especially as you think about lifetime earnings for the candidate as well. Nina mentioned our skills-based assessment. So one of the things that we offer and we think about is how do we focus on skill-based matching opportunities instead of like your traditional resume or experience-based hiring process. We really want to think about how do we customize skills assessment so that we can really promote capabilities versus that experience route. But our newest tool, right, our diversity goals, is what we're doing is we're providing companies of all sizes with a simplified process of sourcing and engaging underrepresented tech candidates. And really important on that is that it just offers employers an ability to optimize their appeal and then gain market metrics to better inform their hiring practices. So, what it does is it quickly allows employers to discover population of qualified and underrepresented candidates. It eliminates this idea of like exhaustive searches. How do we find these candidates? We know that these are active, qualified, diverse candidates. And then it improves our recruiting process. And so one of the things that separates our diversity goals tool from maybe other people on the market is that we really strongly believe that diversity focused hiring and recruiting need to leverage first-party and real-time data to be successful. So if you look at like VC investment over the last couple of years, you'll see something like $350 million US dollars in companies that are doing like AI-based segmentation. But there's a lot of flaws with that, and they are scraping third-party sites and other information. And so what differentiates us is that all of our information is self-reported information. It's provided directly from the candidates themselves, and it's voluntary. And we see that this is a really important step in terms of, one, just accuracy, safe, trusted data from that companies can rely on. But we know that it also is just really effective as well for the companies who've already started to begin using it. So, one of the best proof points that we have is that companies who have started using diversity goals, what they've seen is that 50% of their interview requests are now going out to underrepresented candidates, whereas before it was only closer to 20%. And so we're seeing meaningful increases in companies' pipelines as well. And then that translates out into the hiring process. So a tool we're really excited about. We have a lot of information to continue to gather and use, and we're excited to partner with you, Nina, on that moving forward.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So that was super, super interesting. And I can't wait to see the sort of tools develop over time and see what they bring to the platform. Not trying to brag, Camille, but it seems like I got us back on time. But in just this time, maybe I'll just answer the questions that are in the chat. while the last kind of concluding remarks are being addressed. So for the concluding remarks, and just saying thank you so much for everybody on my panel, but for the concluding remarks, we are super excited to hear from Kalpana Kochhar. She's the Director of Development Policy and Finance at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I just want to highlight that Kalpana is particularly well positioned to close this launch because she combines years of experience as a researcher and policymaker in economics, notably at the IMF. And she also has years of experience as the director of the H.E.R. department at the IMF. So literally at the intersection of the two populations that we had today on this panel. She pioneered many changes in the institution, particularly on gender and emerging markets issues. And she brings with her this amazing experience to her new role at the Gates Foundation. Kalpana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you, all of you. You couldn't have said it better. I mean, the fact that I had done the work on gender, and frankly, doing the work on gender in the IMF was not an easy lift in the beginning, because we needed to convince people that was actually what was called a macro critical issue. But listening to you all today, that debate seems so old and out of date. And I will say that Minouche, the former managing director, Christine Lagarde, and actually the current managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, all of them have really pushed that. And then as an HR director, Nick, I found some of your comments just absolutely fascinating. Happy to say that the fund has made quite a lot of progress on women, but as always, more to come. And to Claire, your points, a lot of the focus in the fund now, in the IMF now, is on these career enhancing moves and being very clear about those. So I'm happy to hear that as well. But I'm now at the Gates Foundation, and I'm delighted that we're partnering with the IMF and Pivotal Ventures, which is of course a Melinda French Gates company. And for me, being at the Gates Foundation is really just, on this particular issue, just so resonates with what I believe in at my core, right? The foundation believes that the undervaluing of women and girls is at the root of every problem that the foundation is trying to solve. And actually putting their money where their mouth is, so to speak. In 2020, the foundation formally launched a gender equality division. I think it sends a strong signal that the foundation places gender equality fully on par with the other global divisions, solving problems around health and financial access and agriculture and so on. Most importantly, it ensures a seat at the leadership table. And so, personally, I found today's discussion really exciting because it was both rigorous with data and evidence. Anecdote is useful as well, Nick, but also really pointing to policies, like what can we actually do? And there are lots of things that we can do, which is both encouraging and sometimes a little bit depressing, because we still are talking about things that we need to do. I don't want to take up too much time, because I know we're kind of already a little bit over time, but I think we really I want to highlight one thing that's come up, and it's related to what was discussed, maybe not exactly, and to remind ourselves is one of the harshest realities of COVID, and is the data that show women and girls bearing the heaviest burden of the economic hardship really across the world, right? No matter what the geography, no matter what the wealth or of the country and so on. So in many countries, we really are at risk of losing a whole generation of progress if we can't act now to ensure economic recovery policies and programs are inclusive and durable. In fact, really asking ourselves, what does it mean to have a gender intentional set of policies for the recovery, addressing the key barriers, women's employment, opportunities for entrepreneurship, childcare, family care, women's health services, and so on. So at the foundation, we are thinking about this work going forward in terms of three priorities: cash, care, and data. Cash meaning to ensure that the recovery and social protection money gets directly into the hands of women. And, there's a lot of things that enable that, including digital technology, which I'm hoping, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. Care, which many of you have talked about in different ways, either through the child penalty or, how to get women to come into and stay in the workforce. So care for us is helping countries build a sustainable caregiving infrastructure, which, by the way, is actually a great opportunity in two ways for women. One is, professionalizing care, so that actually employing women in the provision of care, but also then releasing other women to join the labor force in doing other things. And data. So cash care and data, which you all have done so beautifully today, making the invisible visible, putting it on the radar in understandable ways that resonate with people, pinpointing the needs of women and girls, and developing sort of evidence-based policies and monitoring progress. So from my point of view, I think our partnership with the hub, I would like very much to see much more of what, really continuation of what we're doing here, but maybe also with a focus on developing countries, because not to say that we've cracked all the problems in the rest of the world, but honestly, and if you think about Africa and India, which are both foundation priority regions, these are countries that have amongst the youngest populations in the world and will continue to have. The foregone opportunity by not more clearly including women is unspeakable in some ways. So I think the priority of women is even more acute. But it's been a fascinating, absolutely fascinating day, and the enthusiasm and energy that you guys have has just been remarkable. I personally look forward to continuing this partnership. And you all know Melinda is completely committed, as is the leadership of the foundation. So more and better stuff, I hope, to come. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks, Minouche, especially.
Thank you so much from all of us. And to conclude, things when they work is because of people who make them work. So I want to take a minute to just thank, with not virtual flowers, but real flowers, Anna and Lubala, who've been really at the heart of this. You've all been in touch with them. Without them, none of this would have happened. So I now go mask myself and bring this over to Lubala, while Camille is doing the same to Anna. And I say goodbye and thank you so much for sharing your afternoon with us.